Chapter 26 of A Soldier's Letters to Charming Nellie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Asterix. A Soldier's Letters to Charming Nellie by J.B. POLLEY. Chapter 26. Luxuriating in Feasts and Featherbeds. Botetourt County, Virginia, December the 20th, 1864. Is it a dream, or have I really been a soldier for the last 4 years? Is a question I frequently ask myself nowadays, for here in this old Virginia country home of genuine kindness and hospitality, where I take my place 3 times a day at a bountifully provided table, sleep on a feather bed between clean white sheets, hear the chatter and laughter of little children, and may, when I choose, listen to the low, sweet voices of refined and cultured women, or to the music evoked by skillful fingers from a melodious piano. There is little to remind me of the cruel war except a pair of crutches, my missing limb, and the empty sleeve of my genial host, Captain John J. Allen. The crutches are out of mind as soon as out of sight. My wound has healed nicely and gives no pain. The captain is post quartermaster at Buchanan, and always there during the day, and so, whether talking with the ladies in parlour or library, or he taking snuff and I smoking a long-stemmed pipe, sitting with Judge Allen of the Court of Appeals of the state in his cozy little law office in the yard, and thinking lazily of a future that is always to be happy, I can easily, too easily perhaps, forget my comrades of brigade, regiment, and even company who are struggling and suffering in the cause of the South. It is the most selfish of selfishness, but I cannot help it. This peace and plenty, rest and content, are too pleasant and soothing to mind and body to be disturbed by thoughts of either my own past or the hardships of my dearest friends. Trust no future, however pleasant. Let the dead past bury its dead. Act in the living present, heart within and God o'erhead. May have been, when written, good advice to the civilians of that day, but is not applicable in its entirety to a fellow in my situation. Let the dead past bury its dead is doctrine to which I willingly submit, but I must trust the future, for in it lie all my hopes and ambitions. As for acting in the living present, that is so diametrically opposed both to bodily condition and to feelings that I absolutely refuse to obey the injunction. I want and I need repose, and nowhere can I find it in such perfection as among these kind and thoughtful friends here in the mountains of Virginia. I speak of home so seldom that young Mrs. Allen expressed surprise the other day at my apparent apathy. "Why, Miss Lizzie," said I, addressing her by the name I used to call her when as a callow youth 2 years her junior, and she a young lady out in society, I claimed her as a sweetheart. "I am so sure of going home that I am just luxuriating in the first feeling of certainty permitted me since June 1861. "That statement is not very complimentary to your sweetheart," said she. "Don't you want to see her?" The question placed me fairly on the horns of a dilemma. The one, natural gallantry; the other, regard for truth. To add to my embarrassment, Miss Eva, the captain's sister, entered the room in time to hear the question, but not the prelude to it, and she also insisted on an answer. I hemmed and I hawed, tried the efficacy of a joke I have never known to fail, and went off at a tangent on 6 other subjects, but all in vain. The ladies held me relentlessly to the inquisitorial rack, and in self-defense and to escape a lie, I had to reply, "No, not a bit more than to see my mother and sisters." She is as much a certainty as they." "Maybe not," mischievously remarked Miss Eva. "Ladies change their minds sometimes." "My sweetheart is not of that sort," I proudly replied. "Don't you think I am right?" Whether because of previous long fasting or the keen, invigorating air of these mountains, my appetite has become a veritable tyrant, so insatiate in its demands as almost to ignore the law of physics that no two bodies can occupy the same space at the same time. In camp, my grievance was not getting enough to eat. Here it is inability to eat enough of the plenty I get, either to satisfy the cravings of the corporeal system or the hospitable solicitude of entertainers. As the last forkful of meat on my plate starts to reinforce its predecessors, the judge lifts another slice of ham, corned beef, or turkey from the dish, and if not warned to desist, lays it silently before me. The other folks at the table are equally attentive. Just before I left Richmond to come up here, the veteran came to see me, and as he had been considerate enough to bring his rations along, I could afford to ask him to dinner. Ravenous as was my appetite, the provender furnished by the hospital was barely sufficient for one grown man, let alone two. We had a jolly day of it, for he brought both the latest news and the latest jokes from camp. One of the jokes was on Jim Cosgrove, who helped me off the field on the day I was wounded. Cosgrove is fond of fun and excitement, plays a practical joke on a comrade whenever he can, and is always making himself heard. One day when rations were slenderest and he hungriest, he said to his messmate, "I would eat anything in the world, snails, frogs, grasshoppers, dogs, rats, anything but cats. I draw the line at those cussed, sharp-clawed, treacherous creatures." "I helped eat a cat once," remarked Babe reminiscently, with a far-off look in his hungry eyes, "and it was good, too, and I shouldn't object to the leg of one right now." "But I would," protested Cosgrove. "Just remember that, please, and if you ever have cat for breakfast, dinner, or supper, count me among the missing. Why, I'd eat a buzzard sooner than a cat any day." Babe made no reply, but a bright idea struck him. Cosgrove would be on picket that night, and when he came back next day was sure to be too famished to be inquisitive, and he might be taught that cat was not bad eating, after all his antipathy to it. Luckily for Babe's plans, an old bachelor citizen lived near camp, whose most cherished pet was a half-grown, fat and sleek pussy that was in the habit of taking a nightly stroll through the camp. That night Babe lay in wait for it, and next morning its remains swung from the rafters of its captor's little cabin, and later in the day became the principal ingredient of a rabbit pie, so called in deference to Cosgrove. The intended joke would be too good for one man. Besides, Babe didn't care to be alone with Cosgrove when the truth was revealed to him, and so he invited a friend to dine with them. "What have you got in the skillet today, old man?" asked Cosgrove, when, released from duty and standing before the mess fire, he caught a whiff of savory odors. "The fattest little cottontail rabbit you ever saw," responded Babe with a childlike smile. "It smells good, anyhow," remarked Cosgrove approvingly. "Isn't it most done?" "Yes," answered his messmate. "Get off your traps and take a fair start with us." Soon the three were seated around the skillet, busily consuming its contents. "Humph!" grunted Cosgrove as he closed his teeth on a juicy morsel. "If this isn't good enough eating for General Lee. Where'd you get it, Babe?" "Out of a hollow stump," answered his comrade with his mouth almost too full for utterance. The skillet was soon sopped clean enough to bake a cake in. Then, with his feet high up on the jamb of the fireplace, Jim folded his hands across his corporosity and said in his mellowest tone, "Lord, Lord, Lord, how good that mess was, and how peaceful I feel. Why, babe, a 5-year-old child could play with me now, and I could be amiable even to a Yankee." Babe looked at Jim a moment, took his stand in the doorway, and discovering that retreat was possible, remarked, "I thought you didn't like cat, Jim." "Cat?" shouted that suddenly surprised gentleman. "Cat? Is it a cat I've been eating?" "Of course it is," said the guest, "and it's powerful good eating, too." Cosgrove turned pale as a ghost, and endeavoured to get rid of the portion of the animal he had appropriated, but in vain. His digestion had not been worked to its limit for a long time, and it clung successfully to its prey. Then he got mad, but Babe Metcalf was out of sight and hearing, and the guest could not be held responsible for any deception, and so poor Cosgrove had to stomach both the cat and the joke. "But," said the veteran, "you'd better not say cat to him when you meet. He has already thrashed one fellow within an inch of his life for just mewing like one." As you will perceive, I have made a change in my quarters since inditing the foregoing. Dry Kindred, the captain of my company, had the good fortune, while I was at Charlotte, to persuade a very handsome lady into double harness with him, whose father, a wealthy Baltimorean, has an elegant home at this place, and insists on keeping his daughter with him until the war is over. Wounded the same day I was, the captain got out of the hospital as soon as he could, and flew, on the wings of love, up here to be nursed and petted by his wife. Noting how kindly and unwearyingly she does it, and how the captain seems to enjoy it, I feel like kicking myself for not being a Benedict myself. I might get a course of the same medicine. While I do not feel as much at home here as I did at Judge Allen's, young Mrs. Allen being so nearly kinfolks to me, I get along tolerably well considering. The genuine Virginia girl delights in being a sister to every wounded Southern soldier lucky enough to get within her reach, and as there are 3 of them here who have got beyond short dresses, I get more sistering than somebody in Texas might behold with equanimity. All of them are refugees from the lower Shenandoah Valley. Miss Laura Kay is a beautiful girl whose black curls hang below her waist, but as she is mourning the fall of the cavalryman to whom she was engaged, she is not as sisterly to me as her sister Ida and her cousin Sally Sowers. Neither of these over 18, and both high-spirited, frolicsome, and most pleasantly compassionate. It would amuse you to hear them quarreling over which one of them shall sit next to me on the sofa and do the most for me. To balance the sofa problem equitably, I usually crowd myself in between them and extend my arms along the back of the seat. They never let me use my crutches at all in the house. They wear out the carpet, they say, and so I do all my moving about inside doors between the girls, an arm around the neck of each. It is certainly a pleasanter method of locomotion than hobbling around on a pair of inanimate sticks. When I showed them somebody's picture and warned them I was preempted, which I did, I assure you, the day after I got here, they said they were glad of it, that they had been actually pining for a fellow in my fix on whom to expend their surplus sweetness without risk of being flirted with. Talking over some of the incidents of our long stay at the Phillips house, Captain Kindred explained the cause of an alarm down there, for which I never could account. In order to be near her husband, a field officer in the brigade, Mrs. a 6 months bride, was staying at the house of a bachelor uncle of hers, half a mile in rear of our regiment. That day, the 20th of September, she took a notion about 10 o'clock a.m. to have a swim in an immense bathtub on the place. The darkies filled it nearly full of water from a spring that is icy even in the heat of summer. Not dreaming how cold it was, but longing for instant refreshment, the lady no sooner got rid of every garment that a wetting would endanger than she tumbled broadcast into the tub with an abandon that submerged her, head, foot, and corpus. the corpus weighing fully 160 pounds and being as plump as a partridge. Rising to the surface, she gave vent to the emotions of her shivering anatomy by a scream that reached our camp, and made such a hasty, ill-considered effort to climb out of the tub that it tilted completely over and not only submerged her again, but caught her lower limbs beneath it. Then, of course, she screamed again and again. Such a yelling you never heard, especially as it was immediately joined in by the lady's maid and a Negro man who thought the Yankees had come. The moment it was heard at camp, there was a hurrying to and fro, a grabbing at guns, haversacks and canteens, and the regiment was almost in line and ready to rush to the rescue, when the news came that the whole rumpus was caused by a lady finding the water in a bathtub too cold for her to stay in. This letter, I reckon, will close my correspondence with you from Virginia. Of course we may write to each other many times hereafter, but a part of the charm and romance to me will be gone. Never having seen you, and a description of your personality as persistently denied me as a picture of yourself, I have had to depend on imagination entirely, and have often wondered whether your eyes are black or blue, your hair red or brown, your nose Roman, straight or with a heavenward tilt, your hand and foot small or large, and whether you are short or tall, angular or plump, fleshy or bony. That you are graceful in every movement, good-natured, and with ample variety of mood and manner to make you as charming and fascinating as your letters have always been to me, I am sure. But once we have met, I will have no more fun guessing how you look. Besides, when I leave Virginia, I will leave behind me all the exciting and amusing incidents of the camp, and the march, the skirmish, and the battle, that have furnished me subjects. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of A Soldier's Letters to Charming Nellie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Asterix. A Soldier's Letters to Charming Nellie by J.B. POLLEY. Chapter 27. Adventures en route to Texas. Fannin House, Houston, Texas, March 23rd, 1865. Dear Dick, condemned by high water to a 3 days' delay at this dead old town, and too near home folks that are, and home folks soon to be, to write to them, I have decided to inflict upon you the letter I promised. While I hope it will entertain you, I am not writing as much for that purpose as to rid myself of the ennui of which Bill Calhoun is so fond of complaining when his spirit is too dull to afford a witticism. I have it bad, hence resort to my pen for relief. That much of a camp habit still clinging to me. I never knew how much I loved you boys of the company, regiment, and brigade until I had told you all goodbye, and remembered that to some of you it was a last goodbye. Just to stay with you and share your hardships and risks, and hear you jest and laugh in the midst of all the dangers and trials of soldiering under Lee, I would cheerfully have destroyed my retirement papers, but for the conviction that a cripple would be a burden to you. As it is, I am here in Texas, on my way to home and happiness, feeding high, dressed as comfortably, if not as stylishly, as these trans-Mississippi fellows, sleeping on mattresses under rainproof roofs, and free to go wherever high water and mud will permit me, while you fellows are yet in Virginia, and though ragged, hatless, shoeless, starving and freezing day and night, and sleeping in huts and dugouts, are still undauntedly and resolutely facing a well-fed, well-equipped Federal army, outnumbering you 3-1. If it is patriotism that holds the Yankees in the field, how much more noble, self-sacrificing, and enduring must be the conviction which keeps the Confederates there. I stopped at Charlotte as I promised Alec Wilson I would, and Miss Annie, his sweet little cousin, cried over my crippled and emaciated condition as though I had been her brother. When the time came to take the train again, she walked to the depot with me, and when I had told her good-bye and was on the car, had a darky, who unknown to me had followed us, pass up to me a basket containing a ham, a turkey, a bottle of Scuppernong wine, and as much bread as could be crammed in it. I had wanted to kiss her before that, but dared not. But when the basket was handed me, I got right off the train, and not only dared, but succeeded, taking her completely unawares. She blushed charmingly, but to show she was not offended, said, "You might have done that before you got on the train, but you didn't seem to care to." "To show you how much mistaken you are," said I, hobbling toward her, "I'll take another." "No, sir," said she, retreating, "the picture you carry proves you have a sweetheart, and as I have one too, I can't afford to risk the jealousy of both. It'll be double poaching, you know." At Branchville it was reported that a part of Sherman's army had torn up the track ahead of us, and no train would be run to Augusta. So Hugh Davis and a Virginian, on his way to marry a Georgia girl, tempted, no doubt, by the basket of grub Miss Annie gave me, went back with me to Orangeburg. There a couple of good Samaritans in the guise of old maids hunted up a darky who for a large consideration agreed to haul me and the plunder of the party as far as we could go in 3 days. As it would have been barbarous to make the old darky haul me any farther, Hugh and the Virginian impressed a horse for me, and on him I rode 5 miles to the railroad, where we found a handcar in good running order. Confiscating it, we ran it down the road about 6 miles. Then Hugh and the Virginian gave out. Fortunately, a carriage driven by a darky came along in the nick of time, and we impressed it and were carried to its owner's home. Thence next morning we were sent into Aiken, where we learned that communication between it and Branchville had not been interrupted, and that had we remained but an hour longer at Branchville, we might be now halfway to the Mississippi. Coming within 5 miles of the wide swath of destruction marking the passage of Sherman and his army of marauding patriots, I had to take a stage, and as the inside of the vehicle was jammed and crammed with women and babies, climbed up to a seat by the driver. All night long and for 30-odd miles we traveled through a once thickly settled and prosperous country without seeing a house standing, and without getting out of sight of the charred and often still burning timbers of comfortable homes from which the inmates, women and children and an occasional old man only, had been driven, in many instances in their night clothes, and refused permission to take even bedding for their sick ones. Could General Lee have foreseen such inhumanity, I doubt if he would have made us behave so well in Pennsylvania. Thank God, though, we Confederates have never warred on women and children, and never will. At Montgomery I had to wait 2 days for a boat to carry me down the river to Selma, and there I had a startling adventure. The night before I left, the clerk at my hotel told me that an old gentleman at another hotel would be glad to have me call on him. Not dreaming who it was, I went, and to my surprise and consternation found it was the very respectable but stiff-mannered gentleman who, if he behaves himself and a certain dear one does not go back on her promise, will in the near future have the honor of being my daddy-in-law. His bearing toward me was so distant, caused, I reckon, by a well-founded suspicion that I contemplated robbing him of the one precious ewe-lamb of his flock, that I could not at once muster courage to inform him of the honor I designed him. And alas, before I did, he let his emotions affect his breathing to such an extent that he was compelled to bid me a hasty good night and go to bed for relief. I would have been glad to sound his views with respect to his daughter and myself, but, as the boat started at an early hour next morning, was compelled to defer the undertaking. However, I called at his hotel on my way to the landing, and told the clerk to explain the whys and wherefores, and express my regrets and condolences. It would be funny, though, if the old gentleman held the latter to refer to the future. From Selma I came to Jackson, and thence to Hazelhurst, the present terminus of the railroad. There I fell in with Isaac Stein of Company B, our regiment. He minus an arm, and I afoot. We formed an alliance, offensive and defensive, he to do all the walking, I all the hugging that might be necessary to speed our journey. Hiring a darky to drive us to Dr. January's in a wagon drawn by a couple of scrawny little mules, we advanced 6 miles and broke an axle. A noble-hearted citizen, Dr. Applewhite, came to our rescue, kept us all day Sunday, and on Monday sent us on to a Mr. Duncan's in his carriage. Mr. Duncan, though, could only obey the first half of Sage Homer's rule, welcome the coming, speed the parting guest, and so we were compelled to impress the good old doctor's team, carriage and driver, for transportation 12 miles farther. Learning that every skiff in 10 miles of us and its darky owner had been pressed into the service of the cavalry, we went down to the place where they were. Having but one arm and all his earnings as a sutler invested in the silver watches and spoons with which his valise was crowded, Stein hesitated to make the 5th man in a boat. I did not, though. In the skiff were the oarsmen, 3 cavalrymen, each holding the reins of a swimming horse, and myself. Thus overloaded, our progress across was painfully slow. Twice a horse ceased swimming, and to inspire him to renewed exertion had to be ducked, at the risk of capsizing the frail craft and tumbling its cargo into the water. When we were a little more than 2/3 of the way across, a gunboat rounded a bend 2 miles above us, and came puffing down toward us, and, inspired by the emergency, the darky oarsman bent to his oars with such a will and energy as threatened to break them, but nevertheless carried us to the shore in a hurry. The margin of lowland, 50 feet or more wide between water's edge and the levee, was a bog strewn with drift, large and small. But, driven to haste by fear of capture, I plunged into and through the mud and mire, and over huge logs and piles of drift, with a speed and recklessness which took me behind the levee just as the gunboat got abreast of me. Half a mile from my landing place I came to a rail causeway which spanned a narrow, shallow part of Bruin Lake, and gave access to the island. At the farther end of the causeway, the beams of the setting sun shining upon his grey wool and bringing his weazened ebony face into bold relief, sat an ancient darky astride of as ancient a mule, whose ears, also grey and touched by the sunlight, seemed to be tipping me a cordial welcome. Approaching this strangely harmonious pair, I asked the distance to the house. "Jest up hyar a little piece, master," replied the human being, as, removing his battered old hat, he descended with an effort from the back of his patient confrere. "Just git up on dish yer ole mule o' mine, sah, and hit'll fetch yer dar, sah, 'mediately." Black though his skin was, his heart was that of a gentleman, and though as well able to walk as he, I accepted his offer rather than pain him by refusal. On the broad piazza of the dwelling, busily engaged cutting out garments for the darkies, stood a middle-aged lady, and near her sat a personage in blue uniform, who no sooner saw me than he hurried out to the gate, and, extending his hand, said, "My name is Johnson, sir, Captain Johnson of the United States Navy." Convinced by his uniform and insignia of rank that he was what he claimed to be, and determined not to disgrace my colors by denying them, even if I had fallen among Unionists, I grasped his hand with every appearance of pleasure, and replied, "And mine, sir, is Polly, Private Polley, late of the Confederate States Army under General Robert E. Lee, but now retired on account of wounds and on my way to Texas. Can I find quarters for the night with you?" "I am but a guest in this hospitable mansion," he answered. "You will have to consult the lady of the house, who is now on the piazza. But I shall be glad, if it becomes necessary, to add my entreaties to yours, for as you are just from the seat of war, you can probably give us later news than any we have." Later in the evening, mine host kindly gratified my curiosity concerning Captain Johnson. It appears that a week or so ago General Dick Taylor wanted a gunboat worse than General Hood did down at Suffolk when Bill Calhoun sat down on him. Doubting his ability to secure one by capture, he decided to follow Bill's plan as proposed to Hood, and buy one, and immediately entered into negotiations with Captain Johnson, then in command of one of the best on the Mississippi River. But while willing to betray the trust reposed in him by the Federal government, the captain must have managed badly. At any rate, after the trade was made and all details arranged as to time and place of delivery, he let his purpose be suspected by his subordinate officers. Learning that his intended treachery had been reported, to avoid arrest he took advantage of a dark night to climb over the side of the vessel, drop into a boat, and deliver himself to General Taylor. But although crazy for a gunboat, that officer had no use for a naval commander of the captain's kind, and hence the traitor is now hiding from the Federals and under suspicion by the Confederates. My favorite steed at home being a spirited calico, I took the paint pony, hoping he would be as spirited, paying for him and a buzzard nest old saddle $1,400 in Confederate promises to pay after the war. Mounting him and taking Stein's valise — it did not weigh less than 70 pounds, I am sure — up on the saddle before me, I started, Stein walking. After 5 miles whipping and kicking to make the lazy beast keep pace with Stein, I came to the conclusion that he had far the best end of the bargain, his walking being easier than my riding, and no huggings so far having come to me, or being in sight this side of Texas. But I held to the horse and his valise until night found us at a plantation on the Tensas. There he bought a horse, and managed somehow to ride him, carry his valise, and keep ahead of me and my lazy Rosinante. At Alexandria we had the luck to overtake Captain Haggerty and an Irish beef drover named Murphy, who was well acquainted with the route ahead of us. Together we set out for Mr. Taylor's, 30 miles distant, Murphy beguiling the way by recounting Mr. Taylor's adventures and exploits as a Confederate scout. You may judge of my surprise when, arriving at his house, I discovered him to be a quadroon, his wife the same, and the couple free, and owners of 20-odd coal-black niggers. Taylor, it is said, never buying any other kind than the coal-blacks. At our meals, Taylor, his wife, and daughters waited on us. When we had eaten, they sat down to the same table and were waited on with every show of deference by their slaves. It was an odd condition of affairs, I thought. Murphy, who knows General Dick Taylor well, told me that he and our host were half-brothers, and, except in color, looked the counterpart of each other. At Lewis's Ferry on the Angelina River, my steed came to the end of his row, and I gave him and the saddle to a man who furnished me a tip-top animal to ride to Livingston in Polk County and on Trinity River. There I took stage to Liberty. 10 miles out the team ran away, and for a mile I wondered if I had gone through a dozen battles just to come back to Texas and be killed by a pair of mules. At Liberty I boarded a steamboat which carried me to Galveston. There I ran afoul of Ireland's company of Hobby's regiment. Theirs is indeed a sad fate. Although empty store and dwelling houses are abundant, No private is given a room to himself, but is compelled to share that assigned him with the members of his mess, and they have to live on ham and eggs, fish, oysters, turtle soup, poultry, pure coffee, and a whole lot of other things so new in my experience that I came near foundering myself just tasting them to see if they were good. I got here at noon day before yesterday, and found John Wheeler of Company B, who is minus an arm, you know, delayed by high water. That evening, as he and I sat in front of the hotel, Colonel Gaines of Brazoria County sat down between us and inquired our names and where we were from, etc. When we had told him and conversed a while, he opened a pocketbook crammed with $5 gold pieces, and holding it out to us, told us to help ourselves to all we needed. "You have been fighting for me, boys," he said. "Give me a right to feel that I have been working for you." "Your age excuses you for not being in the army, sir," said Wheeler, his voice trembling, "and your offer is proof that you have been doing all you could to aid us. If I needed money, I would take it as willingly from you as from a father. Not needing it, I must decline taking any." "I think as my comrade does, Colonel," said I. "We take the will for the deed, sir." And so the matter ended. But the old fellow actually went away hurt by our refusal to either take as a gift or borrow from him. A while later, looking over the hotel register, I discovered that Miss Dora P. of Richmond, Texas, was stopping here. She was the last woman to tell me goodbye in 1861, and resolving she should be the first to welcome me back to the state, I sent up my card and 5 minutes later had her little hand in mine. But that is a contingency so improbable that it is not worth mentioning, and I will content myself with the remark that she is pretty and charming enough to heal the broken heart of any gentleman she takes the right kind of liking for. Next morning a note was handed me by the clerk from a Miss Emma M. that was, a Mrs. Scott that is, a wife of 3 months' experience. The first time I ever saw her, she was up a peach tree under which I was about to pass. I do not know what caused me to look up, but I remember distinctly that she had not then arrived at the dignity of long skirts, and that I got from under the tree and out of sight in one time and movement. In the note she asked me to call on her and her widowed sister Feeny, whom I had once tilted into my arms by suddenly running the wheels on her side of the buggy up on an elevation. Of course I went, and being so well known to both, got a kiss from the wife, but none from the widow. I tell you these incidents in which ladies figure, just for revenge, to harrow your feelings. I have not forgotten how you and Captain Jim Hunter appropriated 2 girls each up in the valley, and would not introduce me to either. Give the old boys a heartful of love from me. Tell Jim Cosgrove that if his fondness for cats continues to hurt him, he had better come here to Houston as soon as he can. We have what is called rabbit pie for dinner every day at this hotel, but as there is an abundance of cats running round, I think it is cat pie. Yours as ever, J. B. Polley. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of A Soldier's Letters to Charming Nellie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Asterix. A Soldier's Letters to Charming Nellie by J. B. Polley. Chapter 28. 4th Texas at Gaines Mill. Marlin, Texas, June the 27th, 1903. The following paper by General J. B. Polley was read this afternoon. No braver soldiers fought in the war between the states than the Virginia Confederates. Their survivors are good fellows, none better. The perfection of human nature, though, has not yet been attained by them, for some of these good fellows have betrayed an undue greed for military laurels. not satisfied with hailing from a state distinguished as the birthplace of Washington, Jefferson, Stonewall Jackson, and that grandest of all the grand, Robert E. Lee, not content with the glory won at Gettysburg by Virginians in a charge whose equal in soldierly daring and heroic endeavor the world has never witnessed, these yet hungry ones made the startling discovery, 36 years after the event, that to Pickett's brigade belonged the honor of being the first Confederate command to break the Union lines at Gaines' Mill on the 27th day of June, 1862. A tardy but clamorous champion of that renowned brigade, Adjutant Cooper, entered the controversial lists in the October number, 1898, of the Confederate Veteran. In succeeding issues of that admirable publication, the contention waxed warm. Comrades Vidor, Schatt, and Todd of the 1st Texas, other Confederates, and one or more Federals who participated in the engagement and believed they knew who struck Billy Patterson, the first crushing blow came generously and gallantly to the aid of the 4th Texas Regiment of Hood's Texas Brigade, laying on most doughtily, not only with quotations from the official reports of distinguished Confederate generals, but as well with their own personal recollections of the events of that memorable day 41 years ago. Although prompt to take notice of the controversy and not unwilling to fight the battle over, on paper, I did not get ready to do any firing until the incident seemed, in diplomatic parlance, to be closed. It should remain closed, but for the fact that many persons have read only the Virginia side of the case and are so constituted as to accept loudness of assertion as convincing evidence of statements not specifically denied and disproved. Such people are so plentiful that each member of the 4th Texas may well exclaim, "I see my reputation at stake. My fame is shrewdly gored." For if Adjutant Cooper and his corporal's guard of followers are in the right, if Pickett's brigade, and not the 4th Texas, was first to break the Federal lines at Gaines' Mill and convert what was almost a disastrous defeat of the Confederate army into a glorious victory, the concurrent, contemporaneous statements of Lee, Jackson, Hood, and Whiting, each of whom gave the credit to the 4th Texas, are untrue, and the stories which members of the Texas Brigade have told their sweethearts, wives, and children are figments of the imagination, baseless dreams, memories unsupported by any foundation of fact. If Pickett's brigade is entitled to the honor, the 4th Texas never was, and its survivors and those of its companion Texas regiments should bend their mighty minds immediately to the reconstruction of the long and lovingly cherished legend that, as between the 3 regiments, honors are easy, since although the hell-roaring 4th was the first Confederate regiment to break the Union lines at Gaines' Mill, the bloody 5th routed and practically annihilated the Zouaves at 2nd Manassas, and the ragged 1st held the cornfield at Sharpsburg against Hancock's whole corps, losing in that heroic achievement more heavily than any other regiment, Confederate or Federal, did at any one battle during the 4 years of war. Texans might safely rely upon the statute of limitations to bar the claim of Pickett's brigade, however little they are inclined to want the earth and the fullness thereof. It is unreasonable to suppose Virginians would wait 36 years to present a just claim. If they ever had a shadow of right on their side, it is charitable to presume they would have sought to establish their pretensions while it was possible to amend official reports. Instead of doing that, they remained silent, so silent, indeed, that until Adjutant Cooper raised his voice, not even well-informed Confederates of his own state dreamed of the existence of such pretensions. At any rate, when in 1896 Mr. Corbin Warwick and Colonel Maury of Richmond, Virginia, kindly accompanied me to the battlefield of Gaines' Mill, neither of them mentioned it. Both had been Confederate soldiers and had participated in the 7 days' fighting, Colonel Maury having commanded a Virginia regiment, and Mr. Warwick being the brother of Lieutenant Colonel Warwick of the 4th Texas, who was mortally wounded on the field. Notwithstanding, we discussed the battle, and, old soldier-like, I boasted, time and again, that the 4th Texas was the first command to break the Union lines there. Not a word did they say about Pickett's brigade, except, perhaps, to mention that it fought half a mile to the right of the Texans. In the agitation of mind produced by a long-delayed and startling presumed discovery, Adjutant Cooper and his party have overlooked the topography of the ground and the situation as it was on the day of the battle. The Federal line of entrenchments along the south side of Powhite Creek was several miles in length. The Watts House, behind and to the left of which the artillery, captured by the 4th Texas, was posted, stood about the middle of the line, and the Federals had artillery not only behind the Watts House, but also at other points, and each battery or section of artillery was likely supported by cavalry. In truth and fact, the Federals employed enough artillery and cavalry that day for both Pickett's brigade and the 4th Texas to have captured cannon and repulsed mounted enemies. To this abundance, as well as to the passage of time and a natural, if not altogether excusable, forgetfulness of details, is largely due, no doubt, this controversy between Confederate commands. The survivors of Hood's Texas Brigade cannot, in justice to themselves and their posterity, afford to ignore the claim made by the Virginians, and by silence acquiesce in its justice. The past, and whatever of honor it gave the Lone Star, should be held by secure and unimpeachable title, not a breath of suspicion or boast tarnishing its luster. To remove the last lingering shadow of that cast by Adjutant Cooper and his party is the purpose of this paper. The following facts, all of them undisputed, I think, should be borne in mind. The final and successful attack upon the enemy's works at Gaines' Mill began at 7:00 p.m. The sun set that day in the latitude of Virginia at 7:30. In the assault, the Confederates moved to the southeast, the Federals faced to the northwest, and Powhite Creek ran between the two armies, a triple line of breastworks, each occupied by Federal infantry skirting the southeastern bank of that stream. Having, as already stated, revisited the battlefield at a time when it presented a strictly peaceful aspect, when the only music to be heard was the lowing of cattle and the songs of birds, and when no death-dealing missiles hurtled through the air to the disturbance of one's composure, I can speak with approximate accuracy concerning the distances between salient points. From the crest of the ridge immediately north of Powhite Creek, it is barely a quarter of a mile to the Watts House. From the Watts House to the artillery, it is about 3/8 of a mile. Most of the statements made by the Virginia writers concerning the movements of Pickett's brigade on the day in question may be accepted as absolutely correct. At present, let us follow the 4th Texas. All day long, Porter's brave men had held the Confederates at bay at Gaines' Mill. To break their lines here meant overwhelming disaster to the Union arms, glorious victory to the Confederate. General W.C. Whiting, who commanded the division, composed of his own and the Texas Brigade, approached Hood and said to that gallant officer, pointing in the direction of the guns in rear of the Watts House, "General, those guns over there ought to be silenced, but I have tried to do it and failed." "I have a regiment that can do it," replied Hood. "Try it then," ordered Whiting, and immediately Hood took personal command of the 4th Texas and led it forward. Halting in a stretch of low ground 100 yards short of the crest of the ridge, long enough to form line of battle, the 4th Texas without further delay advanced to the crest, passing over, just before reaching it, a long line of prostrate Confederates who had sought shelter from the infantry fire of the Federals in a kind of swag extending along the north side of the ridge. At the crest, the regiment came within sight and range of the Federal infantry, occupying the triple line of breastworks beyond the creek. These breastworks, by the way, so constructed along the hillside that one line fired over the heads of another. Reckless, though, of the storm of bullets which decimated its ranks, the 4th Texas neither wavered, hesitated, nor halted, but fixing bayonets at the command of the gallant Hood, rushed down the slope of the ridge, into and across the little stream at its foot, through timbered bottom and chevaux de frise, and at the enemy in the first line of entrenchments. Dismayed apparently by the impetuosity and vigor of the attack upon them, these stood not upon the order of their going, but fled at top speed, carrying the 2 lines of soldiery in their rear with them. Following fast and furiously, loading and shooting as they went, the Texans pushed on directly up the slope of the ridge on that side of the stream, and never came to an instant's halt in the resolute and rapid advance until the last armed Federal infantryman in their immediate front was either killed, captured, or driven out of sight in the lowlands of the Chickahominy Valley. The pursuit carried the Texans 100 yards or so beyond the Watts house, the left of the regiment, in its advance, almost brushing the walls of that historic building. They halted, for the first time, on the eastern edge of a peach and pear orchard, where they reformed their line, facing now diagonally to the left in such a manner as to front the 14 pieces of artillery stationed in rear of the Watts house, which were then hurling round shot and shell, grape, canister, and shrapnel by the wholesale at the daring band. The halt, therefore, was not a long one. In the face of such a fire, even the bravest desire to move quickly. The line reformed, and not 5 minutes was consumed in the effort. Hood ordered the charge, and at the word and by common impulse the Texans swept forward and captured the guns, in their charge upon them descending a slope which led into a deep ravine, and after struggling across the ravine, climbing a steep ascent to the top of the elevation on which the guns were posted. Quite a while after they seized the guns, they were attacked by a squadron of cavalry, one of its companies being that in which Hood had served as a second lieutenant in Texas, previous to the beginning of hostilities between North and South. Its captain, Chambliss, I think his name was severely wounded, and General Hood hunted him up and saw that he received surgical attention. Placed hors de combat at a point west of the Watts house, the writer failed to reach the peach and pear orchard. Yet, although worse frightened than hurt, and possessed of a yearning longing for the peace and safety of the rear, he distinctly remembers seeing the 4th Texas in line at the edge of the orchard, General Hood standing a few paces in its rear, holding aloft in his right hand a sword whose bright blade reflected the level beams of a sun still above the horizon. He recalls with the same distinctness that when Austin Jones and himself, Mr. Jones had also been wounded, faced northwest on their way to the rear, the sun shone in their faces. These recollections are sustained by the testimony of the majority of his regimental comrades with whom he has had an opportunity of talking on the subject. Those who remember anything about the sun declare emphatically that it yet shone above the horizon when the 4th Texas reformed for the culminating desperate charge upon the artillery, and that it was yet shining when the guns were seized and silenced. Add to such statements that of General Stephen D. Lee in the letter which follows, and the proof appears positive that the Texans had possession of the guns at sunset. Every presumption and probability favors the contention. The general advance of the Confederates began, according to the official reports, at 7 o'clock in the evening. It is a fair presumption that, having been selected as a forlorn hope to silence those terrible guns, the Texans were given a slight precedence in point of time. Other commands to its right and left must naturally have waited a little while to see what the 4th Texas accomplished. At quite a leisurely gait, men can cover 5/8 of a mile, 1,100 yards, in a half hour. The emergencies of the occasion, though, not only invited, but imperatively demanded rapidity of movement. Hood was as ambitious as he was brave and daring. The stars of a major generalship hung in the near perspective. Like Henry of the Wyand in the combat between the clans Chattan and Curheal, he fought for his own hand. Not a Texan there, whether by birth or adoption, but shared his spirit, and resolved to maintain the reputation for bravery won for the Lone Star by the heroes who at the Alamo fought and died that their compatriots might at San Jacinto fight and win. Therefore they moved rapidly, so rapidly indeed that ere the sun set they had accomplished the undertaking they had set out to perform, and had silenced and taken possession of the artillery in the rear of the Watts house. Where was Pickett's brigade all this while? When did it begin its advance, and when did it drive the enemy from the breastworks in its front? According to General Longstreet, it occupied a position in the Confederate line to the right of that occupied by Anderson's brigade. That position placed its left flank at least half a mile to the right of the 4th Texas. The Virginia writers do not state at what time it began the advance, but they do fix the time at which it made the assault upon the breastworks. It was after sunset. Adjutant Cooper says in the October 1898 Veteran, "The sun shone brightly and the atmosphere was clear, and every move that Lee's troops made could be plainly seen by the enemy. Pryor's line advanced to the attack, and in a short time was almost annihilated. Pickett, with his 5 regiments, went in on a double quick, and being hid by the smoke of the battle, approached to within 30 or 40 yards of the first line of entrenchment, where in the intense heat and the dense smoke they involuntarily threw themselves flat upon the ground and commenced firing. The roar of musketry was so terrific that it was impossible to hear anything else. The men knew, however, that heavy work was intended, as each man had his 80 rounds of ammunition. This continuous firing was kept up, neither side knowing the proximity of the other on account of the smoke. Finally, the firing of the enemy somewhat slackened, and the sun set, as it were, in blood, with neither side having gained any advantage. At the slight lull in the enemy's fire, General Pickett ordered a charge, to which his brigade responded promptly. Such explicitness of detail is commendable. From it we learn that after Pryor's brigade was almost annihilated, and while the sun shone brightly, Pickett's brigade went in on a double quick, and hid, most fortunately by the smoke of battle, approached within 30 or 40 yards of the enemy, and involuntarily threw themselves flat upon the ground, and that they remained thus flatly recumbent until the sun set, as it were, in blood. Add to these facts the significant circumstance mentioned, that each man carried a double supply, or 80 rounds, of ammunition, and the inference in the absence of positive denial by an officer presumed to know the truth is as plain as irresistible that General Pickett's object was not to carry the works in his front, but simply to pour such a continuous and heavy fire upon the Federals there as might prevent them from reinforcing other points of their line. Troops ordered to assault and capture a strong position do not ordinarily carry an extra supply of ammunition. But, be that as it may, the fact stands out in bold relief that not until after sunset did Pickett's brigade carry the fortifications in its front. That true, and it also true that the 4th Texas carried the works in its front before sunset, and stood in line of battle in the peach and pear orchard while the sun was still shining, how was it even possible for the Virginia command to precede the Texans in the capture of the guns in rear and to the left of the Watts house? To say that the Texans waited for the Virginians, that they stood passive, inactive, until after sunset, under such a fire as 14 well-handled guns could pour upon them from an elevation not 700 yards distant, is an absurdity. To say that the Virginians, late as they started, overtook and actually passed the Texans is nonsense. To do that, Pickett's brigade must have been endowed with racehorse speed and have wheeled to the left and passed squarely across the front, commanded by Anderson's South Carolinians. That gallant commander, though, has never complained that its advance was retarded by such a maneuver. Nor, although it was just to the right of the 4th Texas, and for that reason might with greater plausibility than Pickett's brigade claim at least to have aided in the capture of the guns, it has never done so in the writer's knowledge. If, as claimed and believed, the guns were captured by the Texans before sunset, their capture from the Federals by Pickett's brigade was an impossibility. That command was not ubiquitous. It could not have engaged in the capture of artillery while it lay recumbent, a good long mile away, and waited for the enemy's fire to slacken. Time is an important consideration in military movements. Minutes and even seconds count when a battle is on. The official reports and the testimony of the living support the contention that the Confederate advance began at 7 o'clock p.m. Almanacs will show that in the latitude of Virginia the sun set on the 27th day of June, 1862, at 7:30 p.m. The Texans made no halt whatever before penetrating the Federal lines. The Virginians did halt within 30 or 40 yards of those lines, and not only halted, but threw themselves involuntarily flat upon the ground, and waited for the firing in the front to slacken. That this did not take place until the Texans had broken through the lines in their own front and gained the crest of the ridge south of Powhite Creek is evident from the circumstance that when they got that far and glanced back to their right and left rears, they saw the Federals in those directions just beginning to retreat. Whether those to our right were moved by the expenditure of the 80 rounds of ammunition the Virginians had supplied themselves with, or, seeing that the Texans had broken the lines, made a change of base from motives of expediency, is an open question. Those in our left rear delayed their retreat simply because, owing to the nature of the ground over which the 18th Georgia, Hampton's Legion, and the 1st and 5th Texas struggled, it was impossible for those commands to keep abreast of the 4th Texas. While disclaiming the least desire to rob Pickett's division of a single one of its justly won laurels, let me condole with it in its misfortunes, the chief of which, in my humble opinion, is such a reckless eulogist as Adjutant Cooper. One who rushes into print 36 years after an event should have better foundations for his assertions concerning it than his own memory. Company and regimental officers and the privates they command see little of a battle except that immediately before them. General officers have opportunity for more extended observation. Stonewall Jackson, W.H.C. Whiting, and John B. Hood wrote history in their official reports and elsewhere as accurately as it was made by the troops they commanded. Stonewall Jackson wrote, "In this charge, in which upward of 1,000 men fell, killed and wounded, before the fire of the enemy, and in which 14 pieces of artillery and nearly a regiment were captured, the 4th Texas, under the lead of General Hood, was the first to pierce these strongholds and seize the guns." General Whiting wrote, "The battle was very severe, hotly contested, and gallantly won. I take pleasure in calling special attention to the 4th Texas Regiment, which, led by Brigadier General Hood, was the first to break the enemy's lines and enter his works." General Hood, after stating that he took command of the 4th Texas and led it in the charge, says, "At quickened pace we continued to advance without firing a shot down the slope over a body of our soldiers lying on the ground, to and across Powhite Creek. when, amid the fearful roar of musketry and artillery, I gave the order to fix bayonets and charge. With a ringing shout we dashed up the steep hill, through the abattis, and over the breastworks, upon the very heels of the enemy. The Federals, panic-stricken, rushed precipitately to the rear upon the infantry in support of the artillery. Suddenly the whole joined in flight toward the valley beyond. I halted in an orchard beyond the works and dispatched every officer of my staff to the main portion of the brigade in the wood to the left, instructing them to bear the glad tidings that the 4th Texas had pierced the enemy's lines, and to deliver orders to push forward with the utmost haste. Meanwhile, the long line of blue to the right and left wavered, and finally gave way as the 18th Georgia, 1st and 5th Texas, and Hampton's Legion gallantly moved forward from right to left, thus compelling a grand left wheel of the brigade into the very heart of the enemy. Simultaneously with this movement burst forth a tremendous shout of victory, which was taken up along the whole Confederate line. I rode forward and found the 4th Texas and 18th Georgia had captured 14 pieces of artillery, while the 5th Texas had charge of a Federal regiment which had surrendered to it. I have not access to the official report of Generals Lee and Longstreet, but as the latter in 1866 complained that Lee had overlooked his report of the Battle of Gaines' Mill and been guided by that of Jackson, it is safe to presume that Lee was so guided. For other obvious reasons, it is equally safe to assert that in writing the Memoirs of Robert E. Lee, the author, General A.I. Long, Lee's military secretary, was guided by Lee's report when he wrote, "The day was now drawing to a close, and Lee decided to end the conflict by a charge of the whole line. The word charge, as it passed along the line, was responded to by a wild shout and an irresistible rush on the Federal position. The Texas Brigade, led by the gallant Hood, was the first to penetrate the Federal works." President Davis, in his book, Rise and Fall of the Confederacy, says of the battle, "The dead and wounded marked the line of their intrepid advance, the brave Texans leading, closely followed by their no less daring comrades." General Stephen D. Lee has written as follows: Columbus, Mississippi, May 27th, 1899. General J.B. Polley: My dear comrade, I have your letter of May 22nd with reference to Hood's Texas Brigade breaking the Federal lines at Gaines' Mill, June the 27th, 1862. In reply, will state your recollection of the conversation at Houston, Texas, is in the main correct, excepting as to my being with General Lee. I will state the facts as I recall them. It is the first time I have ever heard that any command other than Hood's Texans broke the Federal lines about sundown at Gaines' Mill, nor do I believe that any such claim can for a moment be sustained. On the afternoon of the day the lines were broken, I was across the Chickahominy on what was known as the 9-mile road out of Richmond, and had some guns at the Garnett House overlooking the field on the other side of the creek, and the great battle in progress, distant some 2½ miles or thereabouts. Just before sundown I was on the top of the house with my glass, and President Davis, not General Lee, was in the yard, a most anxious observer, and asking questions as I reported progress. General D. R. Jones also came up about that time on the housetop. I reported our lines advancing and carrying the Federal lines. General Jones took my glasses and in an instant, in a joyous voice, reported, "Yes, our troops have driven the Yankees, and they are flying in great disorder towards the Chickahominy." The President was delighted and overjoyed. Soon after, and before he left, messengers came across the river and said Hood's Texans had swept everything before them, piercing the lines and driving the enemy before them in the greatest disorder. Of course, I could not distinguish at the distance what troops did the work, but the messengers said the Texans had done it. I heard nothing else to the contrary till your letter was received. I feel sure the official reports will sustain the fact that the honor belongs to the Texans. I have always so stated it myself, as I did to your Texas Brigade at Houston. I have not the time now, but if you will examine the reports, the matter can be cleared up without the shadow of a doubt, in my opinion. If I can further aid you, it will give me pleasure. My post office address is Columbus, Mississippi. Yours truly, S. D. Lee. Judge John H. Reagan, the sole surviving member of the Confederate Cabinet, has written as follows. Austin, Texas, June the 6th, 1899. General J. B. Polley, Floresville, Texas. Dear General, I am in receipt of your letter of the 3rd instant, in which you call my attention to the claim which has been made that to Pickett's brigade of Virginians, and not to the 4th Regiment of Hood's Texas Brigade, belonged the credit of being the first Confederate soldiers to break the enemy's lines at Gaines' Mill on the evening of June the 27th, 1862. As I was not on the field of battle, I can only speak from hearsay and the current understanding at that time and since, and from having more than once, soon after that battle, gone over the battlefield with officers who were in the battle. My information and understanding was then, and has been at all times since, that General Lee had ordered our troops forward once or oftener, and that they had fallen back under the fire of the enemy, and that when Hood's brigade came up, they moved forward, and that the 4th Texas Regiment went through the abattis on the creek and drove the enemy from their partially fortified lines on the steep hillside, and drove the enemy's artillery from the crown of the hill, passing on to a depression in the field beyond, where a Federal cavalry brigade charged them and was repulsed. And going a little farther on, they captured a battery of artillery. In the meantime, the 5th Regiment of Texans, Hood's brigade, commanded by Colonel J. B. Robertson, broke through the Federal lines to the left of where they were broken by the 4th Texas, and that together they returned to find the Federal lines closed behind them by a New Jersey regiment, which they made prisoners. I have always understood that the 4th Texas Regiment of Hood's brigade was the first to break through the enemy's lines at Gaines' Mill, and I think the charge of that regiment on that occasion one of the most remarkable in the history of wars. Taking into consideration the strength of the enemy's position, the abattis to be passed through, the 3 lines of infantry to be driven from their partially fortified lines, protected by artillery which crowned the hill beyond them, going into the battle with about 800 men and coming out of it with less than 250, its colonel killed, its major mortally wounded, and its lieutenant colonel badly wounded in the early part of the engagement. Yours respectfully, John H. Reagan. General Longstreet, Lee's old war-horse, tried and true, and in the writer's judgment more sinned against than sinning, has been persona non grata to Virginians, since he dared to doubt the infallibility of a chief not less mortal than himself. As, however, he offered a crumb of comfort to them in a letter addressed to me in 1899, which I have mislaid, I quote it from memory. I wrote to him asking what command first broke the lines at Gaines' Mill. He replied with a brevity that was non-committal. The victory at Gaines' Mill was won by the combined efforts of the Texas, Anderson's, and Pickett's brigade. That was all he wrote. Against it, read the following from Volume 3 of Confederate Military History, beginning on page 290, prepared by Major Jed Hotchkiss, a Virginian himself, and, therefore, not likely to fail in giving a Virginia command its every due. The forests and the conditions of the country occupied by Lee's lines prevented the use of much artillery in this battle of Gaines' Mill, but braver, daring, and more heroic endeavor was never made by patriotic soldiers than on that day all along the lines, especially by Hill's North Carolinians and Virginians, Lawton's Georgians, and memorably by Hood's Texans, who stormed the heights of Turkey and McGahey Hills, sweeping across fences and ditches, through fallen timber and abattis, and over entrenchments which blazed with sheeted fire from infantry and artillery from the entire Federal front, leaving well nigh half of their comrades dead or wounded on the way, and rolling back in a sullen tide of defeat both the regulars and the volunteers of Porter's corps, and becoming masters of the heights they had so bravely stormed. As it ever did, Jackson's Stonewall Brigade pushed into the thickest of the fight, across the path of Ewell, and bore its full share in winning this glorious victory. Comment is almost superfluous. Major Hotchkiss is too just a man, not to say too loyal a Virginian, to suffer himself influenced while writing history by any bias or prejudice. Had Pickett's Virginians taken any notable or conspicuous part in that grand final charge of the day, the fact that it belonged to Longstreet's division would not have prevented the major from giving it its proper meed of praise. But he not only does not mention it, but emphasizes that omission by special mention of the Virginians under Hill and Jackson who fought to the left of the Texans. And why should he say memorably Hood's Texans, if they did not in some way distinguish themselves? When he was writing the lines quoted, it is not likely he was engaged in showering bouquets around indiscriminately and without regard to merit. Holding Adjutant Cooper as the accredited representative and spokesman of Pickett's brigade, his gallantry and efficiency as a soldier, his merits as a gentleman, sans peur et sans reproche, having been vouched for by his old commander, now, alas, gone to join the great majority, I have not deemed it necessary to notice statements made by others in behalf of that command. Each of the other writers patted the adjutant on the shoulder and encouraged him in his heroic but audacious effort to cast discredit on the statements of Lee and Jackson, and to reverse the long-rendered verdict of history that the 4th Texas was the first Confederate command to break the enemy's lines at Gaines' Mill. No other command, brigade, or regiment aided in that, the 18th Georgia overcoming the difficulties in its path only in time to assist the 4th in the capture of the 14 guns. Possibly one or two more companies of the right wing of the 18th went through the line abreast of the 4th, the ground in their front being also quite open. Doubtless, too, there was a sprinkling of Alabamians, Mississippians, North and South Carolinians, and even Tennesseans moving along with the Texans. If so, they were adventurous spirits who, surmising that Hood would give the regiment of which he had once been the colonel the first opportunity to win distinction, straggled to the front. But if any of Pickett's brigade went forward with the 4th Texas, or got with it in time to assist in the capture of the guns, they came from the line of recumbents over which the 4th passed before attaining the crest of the ridge and getting under fire. What troops these were was then and has ever since been a profound mystery. General Whiting said of them that he didn't know who they were and didn't want to know. Some of them claimed to be Virginians, and considering only Adjutant Cooper's admission that his brigade sought safety on the very bosom of Mother Earth, previous to making an assault upon the breastworks, this might appear plausible. Not so, though, when it is remembered that the adjutant carries his command within 30 or 40 yards of the works before the involuntary prostration began. These troops were fully 200 yards from the works. Besides, Pickett's brigade fought half a mile to the right of the 4th Texas. No special mention is made of Hampton's Legion and the 1st and 5th Texas, comrade regiments of the 4th Texas in the brigade. It would be in bad taste to apologize for the omission, since neither will feel aggrieved. Given the same opportunity, either would have done as well as the 4th Texas. Denied it, not one of them begrudges or ever has begrudged to the 4th the honors it so gallantly and fairly won. Their advance was across heavily timbered and marshy ground, and it was therefore impossible for them to keep abreast of the 4th Texas. Besides, it is not likely they began their advance quite as early as that regiment, for it took time to communicate orders in the dense undergrowth of swampy Virginia woodlands, especially in the month of June, when every tree and shrub was in full foliage. End of chapter 28. End of A Soldier's Letters to Charming Nellie by J.B. Polley.